Roman executions were not just about administering justice. They were a show to maintain order. This is what happens to those who disturb the Pax Romana. They are humiliated, beaten, scourged, and put in their place. And if necessary, they are also crucified. If the goal was simply to remove the source of the irritation, then there were certainly faster and more efficient ways they could do that. If, however, the goal was to demoralize and subjugate the population, well, then that required something more public. Following his interrogation by Pontius Pilate, Jesus was mocked, brutally beaten, and publicly flogged. The lashes he received came from a Roman whip called a flagrum, made of leather strands, onto which had been fastened jagged bones with sharpened edges. With each application, these bones cut into the skin and ripped it away. Unless used in moderation, this was not really a means of punishment, so much as the first step toward execution. 40 lashes almost invariably resulted in the agonizing death of the prisoner, either immediately or later on. So Jesus was given 39 lashes. He might have lived, but the blood loss along with the pain was already extreme. After this, Jesus was led away to be crucified. The path they took is today still followed by devout followers, known as the Via Dolorosa, or the Way of Suffering. It winds through the city down several streets, and in ancient times, this was all a parade meant to send the message that this is what will happen to you if you cause trouble. Except, of course, that was not strictly true. Already this day, Pilate had released an insurrectionist called Barabbas at the insistence of the crowd. Asked, however, what he should do with Jesus, the crowd said, "Crucify him." So Pilate obliged. Someone needed to be crucified that day, so why not Jesus? He died instead of Barabbas. This was not justice, it was the politics of oppression. The picture we have accepted as the gospel truth usually shows Jesus carrying the cross, but the victim usually just carried the cross beam to their place of execution. In this case, however, Jesus was already too weak to even do that for very long, if at all, and so another man was forced by the Romans to take up the heavy cross beam and carry it for him. Ironically, that man was just a visitor in Jerusalem who had come that year for the Passover. He was called Simon, and he was from the city of Cyrene, which is located in what is now the eastern part of Libya in northern Africa. For that reason, he is usually pictured as a black man. We do not really know that, however. During the reign of Ptolemy Soter about around 300 BC, 100,000 Judean Jews were forcibly resettled there. Therefore, by this time, there was a thriving Jewish colony there that even maintained its own synagogue in Jerusalem. Maybe then Simon was just unlucky that day. Or maybe he was selected as someone who did not live in Jerusalem all the time in order to make a point that the rule of Rome stretched far beyond the horizon. We will come back to Simon in a little bit. But first we need to hear the words that Jesus spoke to a group of women who followed this procession, described in the Gospels as those who mourned and wailed for him. Jesus turned and said to them, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. For the time will come when you will say, 'Blessed are the childless women.' Then they will say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if people do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry?" Now, apart from the fact that what Jesus said was always important, why was it important for Luke to include this story in his gospel? He may have heard it from someone who was there that day, and therefore included it. But I think perhaps it was important for Luke to put this moment within its larger historical context. That day, Jesus was a victim. But given his identity, this event begged the question of what was going to happen to the rest of them as a nation later because of this. There is compassion in Jesus for the women, even in that moment, because he knows that they will become victims too when Rome destroys Jerusalem altogether. The men may not have been wise enough to listen to Jesus, but no doubt the women were. Jesus tells the women who will suffer like him through no fault of their own that there is a time coming when the tears they shed will be for themselves, not for Jesus. Luke, writing after the fall of Jerusalem, included this story as both prophecy and a warning. If people do these things when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry? In other words, if the Son of God is rejected, what will happen to those who rejected him and crucified him? The answer is that the sinful nation, like the sinful individual, will suffer the same fate. Their tears will fall, whether individually they were complicit or not in the sins of their nation. Why then was Jesus telling them this when they could do nothing about it anyway? Because they could still turn their tears into faith. And there is every reason to believe that many of them did so later. And speaking of later, there is something else you should know about Simon the Cyrene. He had 2 sons, a fact which Mark shares with us in his gospel, specifically calling him Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Chances are that Mark was name-dropping here. Some of his readers knew about Alexander and Rufus. Likely, they were now leaders within the Christian community in Cyrene. In fact, Cyrene became a center for Christianity in that area in the years that followed. No doubt, their father had returned with his story of how he met Jesus that day. And no doubt his children continued to pass on that story with others later, even after their father had passed away. Maybe the words that Jesus spoke to the women that day were also meant for Simon, and maybe he took them to heart. They were both victims that day of Roman oppression. And look what it is that Simon did for Jesus. And then consider again what Jesus did for Simon. When Jesus said, "Take up your cross and follow me," for some people he meant it quite literally. Simon took up the cross of Jesus and bore it to Calvary. And then there is every indication that Simon carried the memory of that day with him back to Cyrene as well. And he also carried his newfound faith in Jesus. Do you know that in the early church, among the so-called Docetists, there was a belief that it was actually Simon who died on the cross instead of Jesus, and that Jesus then took on the persona of Simon and watched him die, laughing at the Romans for their mistake? That is beyond belief for a great many reasons. But it is not beyond belief that Simon himself took on something of the persona of Jesus in the years that followed, as did all of Jesus' followers. They will say to the mountains and to the hills, Jesus said, "Cover us." Jesus was literally quoting the words of Hosea in chapter 10, who in that same passage also said, "Their heart is deceitful, and now they must bear their guilt. The Lord will demolish their altars and destroy their sacred stones. Then they will say, 'We have no king, because we did not revere the Lord.' But even if we had a king, what could he do for us?" Only the truth was the King of Glory had already come to them, and he was betrayed and rejected and crucified. Therefore, it is all the more important for us to heed the words of Hosea when he said, "Sow righteousness for yourselves, reap the fruit of unfailing love, and break your unplowed ground, for it is time to seek the Lord until he comes and showers his righteousness on you." He also said, when that day dawns, the king of Israel will be completely destroyed, and he was right. Jesus died. It happened. It all happened. But it happened so that by faith, the righteousness of Jesus might cover us and so replace our wickedness. And now our God asks us to believe and to join Simon in carrying the cross of Christ to the world. Be safe, and God bless you.